Aisha Miles was here first, 1,000 Pine Points. I don't know why my planned event streaming doesn't work, so I have to go straight to live now. Well, welcome. Kamil's going to be here in just a second, but before he does, I want to introduce the 12 disciples, because I don't just take it for granted that these 12 disciples actually existed in history. They could have. Don't get me wrong, they could have, but there's many reasons to think that a lot of these guys that you see before you, I'll put myself in the Judas square, actually never existed. So I want to, when I was a Christian, it was really tough to keep all these disciples straight. And there's like, 3 sets of brothers in here, maybe even 4. It's hard to say. And their names keep changing from one thing to another. So I'm going to introduce these guys one at a time as quickly as I can, and then I'm going to play some Christians, what they have to say about who these people are and how they died, and then we'll get Kamil to give his thoughts on it. So Peter is also known as Simon Peter, not to be confused with Simon. He was also known by his Hebrew name Cephas. He was the son of Jonas, brother of Andrew. So there's our first set of brothers. Peter and Andrew were brothers. Probably fishermen, and unreliable. Well, tradition says that Peter was crucified head down in Rome. He's head down because he didn't want to be he was unworthy compared to Jesus, so he didn't want to have his head up. He wanted to be special, have head down. Next, we have James the elder. He was the son of Zebedee and Salome, brother of John. So our second set of brothers, James and John. What's interesting about James and John is that they're always mentioned together. And James' second name was Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. And I remember when I was a Christian hearing about that, and that kind of freaked me out a little bit, of that James and John were almost like twin brothers, and they were sort of like Castor and Polydeuces, who were also sons of thunder, the Zeus, the god of thunder. And Castor and Polydeuces were often depicted sitting on the left and right of deities. And guess what? James and John were asked, they asked Jesus if they could sit on the left and right of Jesus in his glory. James the Elder was, according to unreliable tradition, beheaded by Herod in 44 CE, according to Acts 12, 1-2. Actually, not according to tradition, according to Acts. Next, we have John. As I said, it's the brother of James. And unreliable tradition says that he miraculously survived being boiled in oil in Rome, but he was the only guy who actually died of old age, according to tradition. Next, we have Matthew. He was a tax collector. He was also known as Levi. Unreliable tradition has Matthew dying as a martyr in Ethiopia by a sword wound. Then we have Judas Iscariot. It was really hard for me to find a picture of Judas, because who in the world would name their child Judas? So that's probably why I couldn't find a picture. He is the disciple who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He was a Judean, whereas the rest of the disciples were Galileans. He died by either buying a field and falling, causing his guts to fall out, as it says in Acts 1:18, or he died by hanging himself. It all depends what part of the Bible you read. But of course, if you're an apologist, you can harmonize that. Simon the Zealot. Unreliable tradition says that Simon, not to be confused with Simon Peter, was crucified. But we know almost nothing about Simon because he wasn't very popular, unlike the Simon you see in front of you. Next, we have Andrew, who I said before was the brother of Peter. He was originally the disciple of John the Baptist. According to unreliable tradition, Andrew died by being flogged and crucified in Greece over a 2-day period on an X-shaped cross. He wanted to be different than Jesus. He was unworthy, so he wanted to be crucified on an X-shaped cross. You see a pattern here, how they wanted to die not exactly in the same way as Jesus because they felt unworthy? It seems he suffered more than Jesus because he died over a 2-day period, according to unreliable tradition. James the Younger. He's the brother of Jude. So we have another set of brothers here, Jude and James the Younger, these two guys. He is the author of the Epistle of James, according to some, that almost didn't make it into the canon because James is very works-based. If you ever read the the book of James, it kind of is in nice tension with what Paul has to say. Also, according to unreliable tradition, James died as a martyr and his body was sawed into pieces. Not a good way to go. Next, we have Philip, was probably a poor fisherman who became popular in the Gospel of John, just like Phil McGraw became popular on the show Oprah. He is often confused with the Philip in the book of Acts 6, chapter 6, verse 5. Unreliable tradition has him dying by hanging, and he asked for his body to be wrapped in papyrus instead of linen because, of course, he wasn't worthy to be buried like Jesus. Again, another pattern emerging here. Bartholomew, or Bart for short, also known as Nathaniel, some scholars believe he's the only disciple that came from royal blood or nobility. When the disciples went out to restaurants, Bart would always pick up the check, but I'm sure the other disciples would take care of the tip. Unreliable tradition says he died as a martyr by being flayed alive with knives or whips in India or present-day Turkey. We're not sure. Next, we have Jude, who's also called Thaddeus, also called Labius. However, in Luke 6 and Acts 1, he's also called Judas instead of Jude, so he can be confused with Judas Iscariot maybe sometimes. Not to be confused with him, though, because he was Judas the Zealot, not to be confused with Simon the Zealot. Unreliable tradition has it that he died a martyr in Persia by arrows. Then we have Thomas. Thomas was known as the doubter. According to unreliable tradition, he was stabbed by a spear in India after being commissioned to build a palace for the king of India. And then these are the 12. But remember, Judas Iscariot died, and he was replaced by Matthias, who was stoned and beheaded. And of course, we have Paul, who's not on here, but he's maybe like the 13th apostle. He was, according to some sources, beheaded by Nero in 67 CE. So these are the 12 disciples, and I made it pretty clear when I was saying how these guys died that it's according to unreliable tradition. Now, some Christians out there might be thinking, no, that's we have good reason to think these traditions are true and so forth. If you're that type of Christian who thinks that, let me play something for you here. I made a few clips of Christian apologists, pastors, and so forth, and some New Testament historians saying that these older traditions that came far after Jesus, let's say in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, 6th centuries even, they're unreliable and you shouldn't trust them. So here's Sean speaking first.
What's the evidence they actually died as martyrs? And we don't have time to look at all 12, plus James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. We're going to just briefly touch on 4, and I'll tell you how you can track this down and study this to your heart's content if you want to know. But I'm going to show my cards for a minute. In all my research on this, hundreds of hours, I think of the 12 apostles, James and Paul, we have good historical confidence 4 of them died as martyrs. And 2 are at least minimally more probable than not.
So 4 out of, let's say, 14, Sean McDowell's saying here he's confident about. Remember, where do I get 14 from? Actually, it's probably 15. The 12 disciples plus Judas Iscariot's replacement, Matthias, that's 13, plus Paul's 14, plus James, the brother of John, not to be confused with James the elder or James the younger. There's so many Jameses. That's 15.
If you want to see the way a legendary account of the empty tomb looks, look at the later apocryphal gospels, which arose in the second half of the 2nd century after Christ and later. And there you do have these sorts of features like the resurrection of Jesus itself being witnessed by a crowd of hostile witnesses and the Roman guard and all the rest.
So here we have William Lane Craig admitting that you shouldn't really trust these later gospels or traditions because, man, they say a lot of fantastical stuff that are way more fantastical, way more miraculous per se than, let's say, walking on water or multiplying loaves and fishes.
You begin to read the apocryphal works, you get, I think, the sense of the Spirit of God who shows you what the ring of truth is. These books don't have it. These books, the 27 that belong in the New Testament, do. Simon Peter said to them, to the rest of the apostles, "Let Mary leave us, because women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "Look, I shall lead her so that I will make her male in order that she also may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." You want that in your New Testament? Ladies, do you want that in your New Testament?
Yeah, it's funny. This is a very uncomfortable thing, but what if it was true that in order for a woman to enter the kingdom of heaven, she has to become spiritually like a man, like a male? If it's the inspired word of God, then it's the inspired word of God. I think the way that it says in the New Testament, the way women are saved is through childbirth, is it not? Is that any better, Dan Wallace? So here's another example of why Christians even say these later writings are not reliable, because they're just crazy.
Well, there's some problems with these apocryphal gospels. They were late, sometimes centuries later than the New Testament. But the key is that they were late. They were 2nd century documents, or later, even as late as the 8th century. Secondly, although they were popular with the masses, church leaders rightfully condemned them as silly and sometimes as heretical. You get a sense that these books are loony, they're bizarre, they embellish things. And when you read this literature, you go back and you read the New Testament and you say, it's really subdued. When they even talk about the miracles of Jesus, they give you great details, but they don't have they don't have this embellishment that goes all over the map and says, we have a Jesus.
They don't have this embellishment. These later writings, the Gospels don't have this embellishment like these later writings, really? Like the temple being torn in two and dead people coming out of the graves. Well, we don't take that literally, right?
It's hundreds of feet tall when he comes out of the grave, that kind of a thing.
So just to sum up what Dan Wallace is saying is, look, you really shouldn't trust these writings because they're late. Now, this will be a theme. If we don't trust the reliability, the historicity of these things because they're late, then you shouldn't trust the martyrdom stories because they're late. And as Sean McDowell said, maybe we can only trust 4 at best.
Other question, is there any other writings on Jesus' life before his ministry, but after he hit like 12 or 13 years old? Are there any records of his life other than what's not in the Bible?
You mean before he was like 12?
When he was a teenager in his 20s, because he didn't become a minister until he was like 30.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, nothing that would be reliable. You've got the infancy Gospel of Thomas that has some really weird stories about Jesus. One is he was working with his dad as a carpenter, and his dad cut a plank too short, and he's like, I'm not going to make any money off of this. And Jesus said, "No problem, Pop." And he goes over and he stretches the plank to the right thing.
Third,
notice that the audience laughed there, that the story of Jesus increasing the length of the plank, they just find that silly. But yet, what's the difference between increasing the length of a plank or increasing the amount of fish to feed the people? It's interesting what Christians view as a sensible miracle versus just a crazy miracle. Okay, I want to play one more thing, and then Kamil will come on. This is from godquestions.org. So again, I've been saying that all the martyrdom stories for the 12 disciples that I introduced earlier most of it comes from unreliable sources. And you shouldn't believe me. You should maybe believe the other Christians who have the Spirit of God in them, and they're saying the exact same thing.
The only apostle whose death the Bible records is James. King Herod had James put to death by the sword, likely a reference to beheading. The circumstances of the deaths of the other apostles are related through church tradition, so we should not put too much weight on any of the other accounts.
Here's a Christian saying from representing godquestions.org, a place where I think a lot of Christians go to get answers to questions, saying, you know what, you shouldn't put a lot of stock in these martyrdom stories. And yet, I remember as a Christian, so many people, my friends, when they got stuck, when I was asking them questions as a Christian and they just got stuck, they would always come back to this. But they died for this, Doug. Why would they die for this if it wasn't true? Okay, so let's bring Kamil in here. I'm reminded of, let's make sure your audio is working. Okay, say something, Kamil.
Testing.
You're
Hi,
good.
can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay.
Did you ever see the video that Apologia made on martyrdom?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty good. So I want to make sure that we don't repeat anything that he said. So after watching this, go and watch his one.
Yeah.
It's pretty short, I think. It's probably going to be like 10 times shorter than this stream.
Well, maybe not. We'll see. But I want to repeat what Apologia said at least 60 seconds worth, because I think it's very important. And that is, when we think about eyewitnesses to something, it's very reasonable to say, well, okay, if we have an eyewitness, we know who this person is, and he's claiming or she's claiming to have seen something with their own eyes, an eyewitness. And so for the apologetic of saying, you know what, we have martyrs and they would never die for something they know is a lie. Well, Apologia's video is basically saying, we don't even know they saw the risen Jesus, number one. In fact, there's only one person in all of the New Testament who claims to have seen, who speaks in the first person, says, I saw the risen Jesus. And that's Paul. And even that's in a vision or by revelation. Maybe the Revelation chapter 1, you can say that, but it's pretty clear that's a vision as well. And so Apologia's point was, look, show me an example, show me the evidence of someone, number one, seeing with their own eyes, stating that they saw with their own eyes the risen Jesus. And then number two, was put in a position where they had to either recant or just stay strong in that belief of the resurrection. And number three, that they died for their belief in the resurrection. And those are three very reasonable criteria. And you can't find anything to support all three, to say, oh, maybe Peter, well, we'll get into it. Maybe Peter's the closest. But okay, the floor is yours, Kamil. Where do you want to start? You sent me a whole bunch of stuff to show here.
Yeah, so basically, first of all, let me say that this video happened because of Captain Fartlicker, who in the last video's live chat suggested this topic. So if you have an interesting topic you want us to talk about, feel free to suggest it and we can take a look at it. But this is something that I wanted to look into myself as well. So I spent like 6 days researching this, and I went through like more than 80 ancient sources about martyrdom, like read them for myself and put together a lot of stuff. But I basically noticed that there is something like a double standard when it comes to these ancient sources, because on one hand, as Doug said, Christians today are very critical about apocryphal books to the New Testament because they are late and they are quote unquote crazy, like they contain a lot of miraculous, legendary stuff. But on the other hand, I would say almost all accounts of martyrdom of the people that supposedly saw the resurrected Jesus are equally late, sometimes even later as the apocryphal books, and are also full of things that are very fantastical, right? So why the double standard? So this is something that I want to look at. So you can maybe kind of get around that by saying that, yes, these martyrdom accounts are late, but maybe there is like a kernel of historical truth in them. But and all the miracles and all the fantastical stuff is like a legendary embellishment. But then I would have to charge you with an anti-supernatural bias, because why is something mundane, like a person being being crucified, more probable than some miracle taking place, right? Are you saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
You had a nice
visualization, yeah.
Yeah, let me see if I can bring that up. There it is. There.
Yeah.
Okay, so are miraculous claims in late sources improbable? So Christians can answer yes or no here, but if you answer yes, that you kind of doubt the miraculous claims in late sources, then you go, okay, are non-miraculous claims in late sources also improbable? Now, if you say no, then you say, well, you're kind of saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you say yes about our non-miraculous claims in late sources also improbable, then you have to reject the martyrdom claims that you hold dear, that these guys, they would never die for a lie, and they died. Well, you got to reject that if you think that non-miraculous claims in late sources are also improbable. If you say, are miraculous claims in late sources improbable? If you say no, then you have to put yourself in a position of accepting all these other miraculous claims in other religions that are found in late sources.
Yeah, and also you would have to accept all the apocryphal late books, Christian books like Gnostic books, heretical teachings that record other sayings and deeds of Jesus that are not in the New Testament, that have Jesus reject the concept of the Trinity, for example, that preach that the road to salvation is not faith but gnosis, and these kind of things, right? And of course, you'll run into trouble with other ancient religions because they also have writings that are removed from the actual events by a similar amount of time. For example, the life of Apollonius of Tyana, it was written about 120 years after he died, which is comparable to both some of the apocryphal books of the New Testament, but also comparable to some of the martyrdom accounts. And so if you accept the martyrdom accounts and you don't think that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, you should, in order to be consistent, also accept that, for example, Apollonius of Tyana was an incarnation of the god Proteus, because that's what the life of Apollonius of Tyana says. So I think, like, if you're a Christian and you think that extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence is false, then you you have no way to win, basically. So that's a trap. We can talk a little bit more about that. But I want to just show what I've been working on for the last 6 days. So if I can bring up the massive timeline that I put together, we can maybe talk about that. Not sure if you can fit it on the screen.
Is that what you're talking about right here?
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you explain it?
No way. Okay.
Just to make sure that you know what we are going to talk about.
Well, on the top here, you have in bold all the disciples' names, and plus Paul and Matthias, maybe. Now the green bars are from sources that are not apocryphal, and the red bars.
No, actually. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
And the red bars are the apocryphal. And so here you have a list of all the apocryphal works, or not all, but a lot, and their dates. So it goes from 50 to 140. What's the latest stuff here? Yeah, 220, so early 3rd century. And the longer the bar here, the wider the range.
Yeah, exactly. This is just when these books are dated.
And I'm assuming that when we're looking at all the individual disciples here, or apostles, that the green represents more reliable than, that we can actually maybe say it's more reliable than the stuff in red and gray?
No, not necessarily. So the red stuff is just the apocryphal books. So red means that if you're a Christian, you should reject it because it's heretical. And so that's what's below the timeline, and what's above the timeline are all the ancient sources for martyrdom, and I just color coded them green or gray. And green are only the accounts where it says at least where the apostle died and how, right? Because in a lot of these other instances that are in gray, the text just says that the person was martyred, and it doesn't really give you any accounts. Like in vast majority of these sources, there are no details at all. It's just like one paragraph or one sentence. It just says Peter was martyred, but it doesn't tell you how, when, where, by whom, why, and it doesn't give you any details about like what the crime was, what the trial was like, what Peter said in his defense and stuff like that. So only the green stuff at least tells you where and how the person died.
Okay, so if you're a Christian, and you want to try to defend the martyrdom of Jesus, of the apostles, you should focus, in your opinion, you should at least focus on the green stuff because at least you have specifics, some specifics of the martyrdom, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say that if you go to apologetics websites, you'll probably find a lot of other sources mentioned. But the problem is that they often don't even claim that the person was martyred. So, for example, what would be? Irenaeus, for example, says that after Peter and Paul departed, such and so happened, right? And apologists will take the sentence and they will use it as a source. They will basically say that Irenaeus is a source for martyrdom of Peter and Paul. But of course, Irenaeus never says that Peter and Paul were actually martyred. He just says that they died. But he doesn't even say that. He just says that they departed, right? Which presumably means that they died. So I just took the sources where it's explicit that the people in question were actually martyred and not just died.
Okay, I think I left it up long enough, so if anybody wants to go back and freeze the video, they can look up all those sources for themselves. So who would you say is the best martyrdom story? Who has the most evidenced martyrdom?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can just very quickly go through the apostles because I've spent like almost a week working on this, so it would be a shame if it's up on the screen for like 1 minute. Right?
Okay, so which one? What do you want me to bring up?
Let's just start from the top.
Okay. So what we were just looking at. First thing which is really interesting is. So who exactly qualifies, right? Because presumably the apologetics goes that the difference between apostles and other martyrs is that the apostles knew that, like, they saw the resurrected Jesus. So if they were lying, they were in the position to know whether Jesus was really resurrected or not. But at the same time, it also includes Paul, who didn't see Jesus between the resurrection and the ascension, right? Like when Jesus appeared to Paul, it was after he ascended. So Paul technically is in no different position than Christians today who also believe that Jesus appeared to them, right? Like there, you can find people just the Pentecostals
you can go to. Yeah, well, you can even find people who claim that Jesus appeared to them the same way he appeared to the apostles, like they, for example, touched Jesus, right? So I was actually thinking, even today, we could produce additional martyrs like Paul just by taking these people and having them tortured, because if they fail to recant, that's like more evidence for Christianity, right? But then the interesting question is, what if like only 50% of them recant and 50% don't? Does it mean that Jesus, like the probability of the resurrection is only 50%, right? So Paul technically, I think, shouldn't be on the list because from within the story, there isn't really any difference between Paul and someone who claims to see Jesus today.
That point you just made about Christians becoming martyrs even today, I'm reminded of talking to what's his name, Jonathan Pritchett on Braxton Hunter's channel. And I asked him the question, would you be willing to say, I forsake the Holy Spirit? As an actor, as a paid actor, could you say that line, I forsake the Holy Spirit? And he said, yeah, because God knows my heart. He knows that I'm just a paid actor and I really don't mean it. What if that's the case with some of these martyrs back then? Like, well, God knows my heart. I can say, yeah, I reject the resurrection, but God knows I really believe that
That actually happened in antiquity as well, because there were, I think, at least 2 instances when the Roman emperor decreed that everyone in the empire needs to publicly sacrifice to some pagan gods. This wasn't done to like undermine Christianity. It was done as a manifestation of public support, because in the ancient times, your worship of the gods was very closely linked to your loyalty to the state, because the state was ultimately like propped up by the gods, right? So there was this decree, And obviously, Christians were in big trouble because it wasn't possible for them to sacrifice to the pagan gods. So we know from ancient records that a lot of Christians actually did that. So they technically leave Christianity because they didn't want to face persecution, and then they wanted to come back. And as far as we can tell, their rationale was that, yeah, we sacrificed to the pagan gods, but we repented afterwards, so now we kind of want to be let in. And we have writings, for example, by Cyprian, where he's kind of wondering whether these people should be let into the church because they were apostates at some point, right? So we even have evidence of that happening in the ancient times.
Yeah, if God knows your heart, then what's the big deal of recanting just for fun? Because God has work for you to do on this earth. You know, you have to bring people into the fold, evangelize, and you can't do that if you're dead. So God knows your heart. What's one little lie, right? To save. Okay, so let's quickly go through let's start with Peter, because he was the first one on my list when I made the introductions. Talk about Peter's martyrdom.
Yeah, sure. So just to correct what you said, the upside down crucifixion, that's actually a very popular myth. So the first source where the upside down crucifixion shows up is the Acts of Peter. And in it, he says that the reason why he wants to be crucified upside down is because people, like when babies are born, they are born head first. So that's the reason. He never says that it's because he doesn't want to die the same way Jesus died. That's just like a popular myth. And I think that because, you know, martyrdom is not necessarily an extraordinary claim, and we have a lot of good evidence that Christians were martyred, and people being martyred is not like miraculous or anything like that. So I think for Peter, we have actually pretty good evidence. Most importantly, it's because the Gospel of John 21:18, I think if you want to bring up picture number 4, it actually seems to allude to the martyrdom of Peter. So presumably when the Gospel of John, which is usually dated to like 90 to 100, so it's presumably the latest of the canonical Gospels, it has this line. It's right at the end. Jesus says, very truly I tell you, when you, meaning Peter, were younger, so on and so forth, and it ends up by saying someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. So this is taken usually as Jesus prophesying that Peter is going to be martyred. And the explanation is that the author of the Gospel of John, when he wrote the Gospel, already believed that Peter was martyred. And that could have been true, or he could have been mistaken. In either case, he put it into the Gospel. And if you buy that this is a reference to martyrdom, I think this is pretty good evidence that Peter was martyred, right? Like, I have no problem taking that. Just like there are, for example, Greek philosophers who were martyred. Socrates is, of course, the most famous examples, but there are actually others who refused to recant some of their beliefs, and they were tortured and executed. And in some cases, the evidence is actually pretty late. But just because it's not an extraordinary claims, you need that strong evidence to support it, which is fine. But the problem is, of course, that this doesn't say anything about the circumstances. In some cases, the evidence is even worse than that. If you bring up picture number 2, that's again another ancient text that's presented as evidence for Peter's martyrdom. But as you can see, it's even more up in the air. This is from the Ascension of Isaiah, which is a 2nd century Christian document, it's basically a forgery. It claims to be a vision that was received by the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, but it was actually written in 2nd century by a Christian author. And it talks about basically Satan, who is here called Beliar. And he mentions the 12 apostles of the beloved, who is Jesus, of course. And it says one of the 12 of the 12, one will be delivered to his hand. And this is used as evidence of the martyrdom of Peter. The rationale is that one of the 12 could be Peter, and the 2nd century author of the Ascension of Isaiah therefore must have known that Peter was actually martyred, right? So this is the kind of evidence that we are dealing with. And the first really solid description of why and how Peter died are the Acts of Peter, who are usually dated to the end of the 2nd century. And they actually give you the details. So they actually tell you what Peter did, why he was martyred, and stuff like that. So you can read about it. But the problem is that it's obviously ahistorical. It's not even supposed to be a history, like a historical work. It's basically a novel. A lot of these Acts of Apostles that record their preaching and martyrdom are actually written in the genre of a novel. It's often a romance because it features a couple who, a young man and a young woman, who instead of getting together in a loving relationship, which is usually how ancient romances ended, they convert to Christianity, they are baptized, and instead of having a romantic relationship, they devote themselves to chastity. So it's technically a romance, but it's subverts the expectation of the reader about how a romance should end in order to promote Christian values like sexual purity, chastity, and stuff like that. And of course, in the Acts of Peter, for example, Peter publicly preaches in Rome. A lot of Romans are converted, including knights and senators, which is absolutely impossible. The idea that in 60s, 1st century, there were senators who converted to Christianity in Rome is absolutely crazy. What's interesting is that Peter isn't arrested because of him preaching the resurrected Jesus or something like that. What happens is that he converts wives of some powerful men to Christianity, and these wives then decide to leave their husbands and devote themselves to chastity. So they don't want to remain in the household of pagans, and they don't want to have sex with them, which of course contradicts the teachings of Paul, who says that if there's a mixed couple, then they should stay married. But Peter is arrested by one of these husbands who gets angry because his wife no longer wants to have sex with him, and he's crucified for godlessness. And this is actually a theme which is very common in these martyrdom accounts. So the apostle is actually arrested not because of what he preaches, because he usually in these acts he preaches publicly. There are massive crowds of people following him. Nobody seems to have any problem with that. He's always arrested because he converts a wife of someone powerful. It's usually a proconsul who then doesn't want to have sex with the husband, and the husband becomes angry and arranges the arrest and the martyrdom.
This is
right?
the PineCreek theorem.
And what's yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Because the PineCreek theorem, for people who don't know, is my theory is that women have converted more men to Christianity than the Holy Spirit could ever do. And what Kamil is saying is the reason why a lot of these apostles were martyred is not because they were preaching the resurrection or they wouldn't recant. It's because they got the wives of these important people to convert to Christianity, and then they wouldn't sleep with their husbands.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the reverse, actually, of the theorem, because if the theorem was correct, then the husband would become Christian, right? But here, the husband is kind of playing a role of the villain, because he, just like the romantic couple, kind of embodies the Christian virtues like sexual purity, chastity, and stuff like that. The husband, the jealous husband, is kind of an embodiment of the pagan vices. So he's enraged, he's very angry, he's obsessed with sex and stuff like that. So that's why these apostles are martyred. And it's true that in these Acts of Apostles, the apostles are usually given the opportunity to escape. Because usually there is a crowd of people who's kind of cheering them on, and they offer to arrange their release, or they are demanding their release. But in these Acts of Apostles, the apostles usually decide to like voluntarily go through the martyrdom and avoid being rescued. So it's that theme is definitely there. Like the martyrdom is voluntary; nobody is forcing them to go with that, and they have the opportunity to get away. But these stories are just like, they are not even supposed to be historical, and they contradict what we know about how Christians were actually persecuted. So the apostles are not asked to sacrifice to the altar of the emperor, for example, which is how that was one of the biggest problems pagans have with Christianity, right? Like Christians refused to worship the emperor as a god, which was like a symbol of loyalty to the Roman state. They are not questioned about the resurrection, teaching the resurrection. They are allowed to preach in public. Nobody obstructs them. And the reasons for their arrest and martyrdom are completely different.
Okay, so they weren't.
So that's Peter.
They weren't killed. Well, Peter at least wasn't killed because of his belief in the resurrection, is what you're saying. It's because of other reasons.
In the earliest accounts, and as far as I remember, in none of the accounts that actually gives any details. And the same is true with the Acts of Thomas, the Acts of Andrew, the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Philip. And what you also notice is that they are very similar. Like these Act stories are very similar. They usually follow like the same pattern. There are like similar characters. Some of the scenes are the same, basically. Yeah. And what's important to realize is that like they are not supposed to be histories or biographies or anything else. They were intended to be ancient novels, and we have other examples of ancient novels that are not Christian martyrdom accounts, right? So we can like analyze them from the literary standpoint, and we can assess their historical value on that basis. So I would say it's just like not a reliable source of information about what actually happened to these people.
Okay, and then to sum up Peter, basically you have three greens here. So you have in the early fourth century to mid fourth century, and late second century, you have three sources where it gets into the details of the martyrdom of Peter, and then that's it.
Yes. And also, like these apocryphal acts, some of them are actually heretical. Like if you analyze the Christian teachings that they espouse, it's not orthodoxy. So if you accept the martyrdom account, do you also accept, because like in some of the cases, the apostles are actually saying things which are heretical, right? Because the acts were written by people who were not part of the orthodoxy.
This gets to what I played earlier on the clip of Dan Wallace and William Lane Craig and so forth, is that they realize this, and so they kind of, and Sean McDowell, they're kind of like they're backing off and saying, look, we got to take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. We can't be sure that this actually happened because it was written late and it has all these weird fantastical claims and so forth. But now you're adding to, besides the fantastical, you're saying that they were heretical.
Yeah, I mean, so in preparation for this, I actually read McDowell's book, Fate of the Apostles. It's very good in terms of going through all these sources. In terms of like what's he doing with them, I would say it's the second worst after Richard Bauckham. But it's a good resource. And it's interesting that he doesn't want to accept what these martyrdom accounts teach about Jesus, about the nature of the Trinity and stuff like that. But he still wants to use them as like reliable historical accounts about what happened to the apostles. So he says, yeah, they are late, they are embellished with legendary stuff, but there is like a kernel of historical truth in them. So for example, when it says that, I think it's Andrew, gave someone miraculous diarrhea, that's later legendary embellishment, but we can still trust the account because it says that Andrew was martyred. And when he does that, when McDowell does that, He sounds exactly like Bart Ehrman.
Hang on. What did Andrew say about diarrhea?
Yeah, so there is a scene where Christians are gathered in the house of a proconsul, who is like the main villain, and they are basically hiding there. It's like their secret place of congregation, and the proconsul is like coming back home, right? So there's the situation where they need to escape very quickly, and in order to buy themselves some time, Andrew just gives him diarrhea. So he's like miraculously spends a lot of time in the toilet, and all the Christians can sneak out of the house. That's one of the details in these accounts.
That reminds me of That reminds me of the movie "1,000 Ways to Die in the West." They had the duel scene, and the guy gets diarrhea. But anyhow, yeah. Okay, so are we done?
But my point is that like Sean McDowell sounds exactly like Bart Ehrman, right? Because he wants to he wants to discard all the miraculous stuff because it's late, legendary, and probably heretical, and he wants to like mine the golden nugget of historical truth, which is fine. If he wants to do it, that's fine. But then he needs to commit himself to the claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that things that we don't see happening in nature today are like inherently less probable than normal, like ordinary stuff, like someone being crucified, for example.
Yeah.
And if he wants to do that, that's fine, but he needs to be consistent.
Yeah. So basically, we were saying, if you're going to accept these martyrdom claims just because it helps build confidence in the believers of Christianity, you should really start to accept all these other claims found right next to it, and not just cherry pick.
Yeah, and miraculous claims in other religions, because then in those cases we also have sources that are just as late, like in the same range.
Okay, let's go. Let's move on to James and John, because they're next on my list.
They are actually. Yeah, they are actually. So the sons of Zebedee, right?
Yeah, right at the top here. Okay.
Yeah, they're actually interesting because that's another pair where the martyrdom is implied in the Gospels. So if you pull up number 6, that's a quote from Mark. I think it's 10:35 to 40, where they basically come to Jesus and they ask him to be seated next to his throne, and he basically says no, and he asks them, do you want to drink the cup, or are you able to drink the cup that I drink? And they say, yeah, we are able. So he says, okay, the cup that I drink, you will drink. And this is usually intended or understood as Jesus saying that, okay, the two of you are going to be martyred just as I am. Because every time the cup is mentioned, it's basically like a metaphor for martyrdom, right? Or suffering. It's either a cup or a crown. It's often said that the martyrs win a crown of martyrdom. So in this case, we have an attestation to their martyrdom in 70s, which is pretty early. But if you actually accept
this goes against what a lot of Christians say, that John was the one guy who died of old age because of natural causes, because they need him to live long, so he would have written the Gospel of John later on.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but just let me make one point before. So if you accept that the cup means martyrdom, then you should also accept that Jesus prayed not to be crucified in the Gospel of Mark. I think it's in chapter 14. He says, Abba, Father, for all things are possible, remove this cup from me, right? So if you think that cup means martyrdom, that's really weird. Really, Jesus prayed to himself not to be crucified. He didn't want to go through the crucifixion, right? Like that's difficult,
but Christians,
at least a little bit.
Christians have a good answer for that, or I shouldn't say good, but an answer for that. They just say, well, that's the human side of him.
I think in some later Gospels, this is even made like more explicit, where right after that, Jesus says, the soul is willing but the body is weak or something like that, right? So they want to make explicit that the reason why Jesus does that is because it's like his human nature. But in the Gospel of Mark, it actually says that he was like distressed, right? He was really like freaking out because he basically got scared, which is an interesting thought. Like if you read the Gospel of John, that's not the same Jesus, basically. It's a completely different character.
I spoke of this verse in my intro when I introduced the 12 disciples at the very beginning. Do you believe that James and John actually existed in history because of this verse? I mean, like, does this verse make you doubt that they existed?
Yeah, I think a little bit because of the similarities with the Dioscuri, right, with Castor and Pollux. But I have to say that I don't buy the premise that there is mimesis of Homer. But I have to say, like, I haven't done any detailed research myself into it. I want to take at some point at least a week to read through Dennis MacDonald and stuff like that. Like, I only know about it basically secondhand. And
I remember 15 years ago or so, I was still a Christian, and I remember reading this. I had skimmed over it when I was a kid, of course, and I'd read Gospels before, but this really hit me like a ton of bricks, that James and John were known as basically the sons of thunder, just like the sons of Zeus. And thinking, my goodness, this does not sit well, that this is really sounding like a borrowing or a plagiarism from Greek mythology. And that caused me a lot of doubt, or some doubt at least.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, like, even if it's true that the mimesis is there, that doesn't necessarily establish that the people are invented, right? Like, it could be the case that they were really like two brothers, and it's just that the author of the gospel decided to depict them this way. But the problem is that if you take what we know about them and you remove all the stuff, then you basically have nothing left, right? You have just names.
Yeah.
So does it even make sense that these characters and the way how people think about them actually existed? Probably not, right? But you rightly pointed out that this implied martyrdom actually seems to contradict what we read about them later, specifically in the case of John, son of Zebedee, right? So Gospel of Mark seems to imply martyrdom. Then Papias, who is everyone's favorite when it comes to early attestation of gospel authorship, says that both James and John were martyred in Jerusalem. But the problem is that then basically everyone else says that John died peacefully in Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor, of natural death. And he apparently lived to be very long, very old, because he was exiled to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote, of course, the Revelation, and he was released during the reign of Trajan, which means that he lived either Trajan or Nerva, I can't remember now, but he lived to 90 CE basically, so he would have to be very old. So yeah, there are conflicting accounts, and in some later sources, for example, in John Chrysostom, in one place in his writing, he says that both James and John were martyred, but in other place he says that only James was martyred and John died of natural death. Right, and it seems to be the case that this disagreement was motivated by theological reasons, because there were some Christians who did not like the book of Revelation, so they wanted to disconnect it from James, an apostle, and they wanted to say that it was actually written by someone else named James, and this is not the son of Zebedee, one of the top three guys basically that were with Jesus all the time. So that's actually interesting. So here we have conflicting accounts. According to some sources, he was martyred. According to others, he died of natural death. And when it comes to James, he's obviously beheaded in Jerusalem. He's one of the people who are martyred. He's beheaded by, I think, King Agrippa. But it again, Acts don't give any details. It's in Acts 12. It just says about the time King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, brother of John, killed with a sword. So no details. We don't know like why he died.
Yeah,
Whether
Christians,
he was asked to deny the resurrection and stuff like that.
What do you say to Christians? Because I remember talking to Jonathan McClatchy about this a long time ago, and what he says, well, the whole idea of Christianity is based on the resurrection of Jesus. So when it doesn't say exactly why they died, it's a very reasonable assumption that they died for the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, yeah, that's fine, but the problem is that we are talking about these people specifically, right? So the argument for martyrdom has a lot of moving parts that all need to be in place in order for that argument to work. Some of it was listed in the Apologias video, right? So you need to show that the person had the opportunity to recant. You have to show that, for example, if they recanted, they would actually be released, because in case of the persecution by the Jews, these people would be condemned based on the law of Moses. And of course, nowhere in the law of Moses it ever says that if you recant, you are not stoned, right? So let's imagine that an apostle is arrested by the Jews for preaching the resurrection. He recants later. He would still be stoned because the law of Moses doesn't say anything about recanting, right? It doesn't give you that out. So there's a lot of moving parts. So you cannot argue that just because Christians were usually martyred in a certain way, these specific people were also martyred a certain way, right? You need to argue about the specifics, because it's you, the Christian, who are saying that these people are in some special position, different from just ordinary Christians, right? They are special because they were the ones who supposedly saw the resurrected Jesus, right? So it's not enough to say if they were martyred, they would be martyred like this way for this reason and stuff like that.
Well, you just said you said something that I think will actually resonate with Christians a lot, and that is, think about an Old Testament person who commits adultery and is about to be stoned, and they recant of their adultery, they repent of their adultery, they say, sorry, I will change my ways, I really don't want to be an adulterer anymore. It's like, okay, great, good for you, but we're still going to stone you. And the law of Moses would still apply to these Jews in the 1st, 2nd century.
Yeah, now I mean, think of all the instances where heathens are killed in the Old Testament, right? Like there are entire nations who are slaughtered, basically entire cities, just because they were basically worshipping the wrong gods, or they were descendants of the wrong brothers and stuff like that. In case of the Canaanites, right? So like the Jews never asked them, "Do you want to worship Yahweh?" They just killed them because they were heathens. They are worshipping other gods. So. Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about Peter, James, and John. Do you want to go to Matthew?
Yeah, we can go to Matthew, no problem. Okay. So what do we have for Matthew? It's not a lot. What's really funny, actually, is that there is one account which lists apostles who died naturally. It's cited by Clement of Alexandria. It's a guy named Heracleon, who I think was agnostic as well. And he differentiates between Matthew and Levi. So he thinks that they were two different people, even though Christians usually believe they are the same person in order to harmonize the Gospels, right? Because I think in Matthew, the tax collector is called Matthew, but in Luke and Mark, he's called Levi. But according to this very early source, they were two different people. So again, you have to do some cherry picking.
What's the name of the source?
Sources in order to. It's Heracleon. He was I think he was agnostic. He was like, yeah, and he put together a list of apostles who died of natural causes, and he includes a couple of names that, of course, are later contradicted by other martyrdom accounts. And he lists Matthew and Levi separately as two different people.
So that's
And
why you
you
have the
can,
dotted line in here. Okay.
yeah, exactly. And you can't even say that, like in the original Greek, it's meant to be the same name, because there is actually, I think, Philip in between them. It says Matthew, Philip, and Levi, if I understand correctly, right? So they are clearly meant to be two separate people.
Yeah, this is exactly why guys like Robert Price doubts that a lot of these disciples even existed in history.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of confusion about the names, right? Like even in the martyrdom accounts, Matthias is confused with Matthew. James, son of Alphaeus, is confused either with James, brother of Jesus, or James, son of Zebedee. Simon the Zealot actually is confused with two different people as well. Either Simon, son of Clopas, who was the second bishop of Jerusalem, or with Simon, the brother of Jesus, who is mentioned in Mark 6. Philip, there are two different Philips, one in Gospels and one in Acts, and they are also confused, for example, by Eusebius. So there was a lot of people with the same name, and it was very difficult for Christians to keep straight who's who. Like even today, scholars are arguing how many Johns there were and who wrote what and what the details of their lives is. And of course, my favorite topic, I'm in the extreme minority of scholars. Well, I'm not ex-scholars, but I am on the side of the extreme minority of scholars who think that Peter and Cephas mentioned in Galatians are actually two different people. So Peter and if you read the Pauline epistles, when Paul mentions Peter, when he mentions Cephas, he's actually talking about two different people who were then conflated into one person that we know as Peter today. Almost nobody thinks that, but I think this is very probable.
Okay, so we've done. So basically, there's nothing much on Matthew to say that he died as a martyr. Peter, we have some stuff, some specifics, but it's again late, and why accept it? James and John, we have conflicting reports. Some sources say he was martyred, some say he wasn't. James, the elder, which is the brother of John, not the brother of Jesus. We have some specifics from later sources that he died a martyr. How about Judas? He committed suicide, but how, we're not sure. Simon, do we have anything on Simon? Not to be confused with Simon Peter.
Simon the Zealot, right? Simon the Canaanian. Yeah, so we don't have anything. So for Simon, James, son of Alphaeus, Jude / Thaddeus, and Matthias, we don't have, as far as I know, anything from the first 300 years. And all of it, like all the later sources, they are usually contradictory, right? So for example, Simon the Zealot, according to one account, he died in Persia. According to another, he was martyred in Persia. According to the other account, he died of natural death in Jerusalem. According to Dorotheus, he was crucified and slain. I don't know how you do that. I guess you like put him on a cross and then you cut his head off. In Britain, so either in Persia, Jerusalem, or in Britain. James, son of Alphaeus, is either crucified in Persia, martyred in Egypt somehow, or stoned in Jerusalem. Jude is either martyred in Persia, dies a natural death in Syria, or natural death in Asia Minor. So yeah, I mean, these like less known apostles, they are all over the place, and the sources are always very late. And this kind of shows you, like, there is a reason why we see this pattern, and it's because it was prestigious for Christian churches in various countries to claim apostolic authorship, like apostolic tradition, basically. It was advantageous for them to say, look, our community isn't just any random Christian community. It was actually founded by one of the apostles, right? So that's why you have the same apostles going all over Europe, because everyone wanted to be able to say, we were actually founded by one of the people who was sitting at the feet of Jesus, right? And if you claim this apostolic tradition, then it kind of makes sense to also have a martyrdom story, which places the apostles' death in the location where the church existed. And there are other reasons. For example, martyrdom sites as early as 4th century were actually destinations of pilgrims, and pilgrims bring in money. So there was a monetary gain with like having like a burial site of some apostle. I think Thomas, like a burial site of Thomas in Syria, is attested in late 4th century, specifically as a pilgrimage site, which of course contradicts a different account according to which Thomas was martyred in India. So yeah, I mean, there are reasons why these discrepancies are there.
Well, it's deeper than that. There's reasons why they would lie.
Yeah,
Right?
can you think of some of the reasons?
Well, what you just said. It's you can get a bigger following if you say, "Oh, Thomas was our guy. He actually was here 50 years ago. He was hired to build in my intro, some Christians say that Thomas was hired to build a palace for a king or something like that. Have you ever?
Yeah, I think it's in the Acts of Thomas.
Yeah. And so anyhow, there's motivation to lie, just flat out lie and say these disciples were here because now we get people coming to our church. It's like Shaquille O'Neal. He starts a restaurant in Las Vegas. People will go to that restaurant just because Shaquille O'Neal started that restaurant, even though he's almost never, ever there. They'll say, "Oh, hey, me and my buddies, we ate at Shaquille O'Neal's restaurant in Vegas the other day. Isn't that great?" And it's the same thing. Hey, we're in a church that Thomas started, basically. Isn't that great?
Yeah, and also you have to remember that like the early history of the church is full of politicking. Like people always imagine that they were persecuted and everyone was kind of like band together and stuff like that. But if you actually read the church history, there was a lot of competition, rivalry about resources. So like different bishops disagreed with each other about important things. So it was politically advantageous for them to be able to say, look, our church in Armenia was actually founded by one of the apostles, right? So we have this authority that you guys in Georgia, for example, don't have.
So basically, on this list here, you said basically we have nothing for Simon, Jude, Thomas. Do we have any? We have something for Andrew and Philip, though, right?
Yeah, we have Acts of Andrew and Acts of Philip. If you want to bring up number 9, okay, that's really interesting for us to look at.
There is no number 9.
Sorry, number 8.
There we go.
Yeah. So just to show what kinds of like details we have for the arrest, trial, and execution of some of the apostles in these later sources, I like created the synopsis of the trial and martyrdom of Philip from the Acts of Philip, so that you like people who are listening get the idea what kind of sources we are talking about, right? So Philip, as I mentioned, he's one of the guys who converts a wife of someone important who later is responsible for his death. In this case, it's proconsul, and she, as it's usual in this type of literature, she wants to devote herself to chastity. So the proconsul is obviously enraged, and he arrests Philip and some other Christians, which includes a talking leopard and a young goat that he met earlier in the lands of dragons.
Talking leopard.
Earlier in the Acts. Yeah, talking leopard. Yeah. There is Philip goes to the lands of dragons, and there are 2 animals that talk, and they basically become Christian, and they are following him since then. So they are arrested. Philip is stripped naked, and he's put on a cross. And one of the female Christians is stripped naked. She starts glowing like an ark full of glass, light and fire, and the executioners run away. Then John, out of the blue, he's not part of the narrative before, he arrives, and they try to arrest him. The executioners, even though they have just run away, they try to arrest him, but their hands are miraculously paralyzed. And at that point, Philip becomes angered, he's enraged, and he causes the earth to miraculously open up and swallow a crowd of 7,000 people who are there at the crucifixion site. But Jesus appears, he rebukes Philip for becoming angry, and he punishes him. And Jesus basically says, look, after you are martyred, you will have to wait for 40 days before Archangel Michael lets you into the paradise.
I wonder where he was for
And
those 40 days. Like, is there a back alley
Well, he was in
outside of
limbo.
heaven?
Yeah, he was in limbo. No, not in limbo, in the purgatory, I think. The text doesn't say that, but this is usually how that's explained. He's just waiting outside the gate, basically. And then Jesus creates a cross filled with light, and the people who were previously swallowed up by the earth use it to climb back. And they want to release Philip because now they believe in him. But Philip insists on going through the martyrdom, and he dies, right? And interestingly enough, inside that story, Jesus, when he appears, says that Bartholomew is going to go ahead and be martyred, I think in Laconia, in Lycia, which is one of the earliest accounts of martyrdom of Bartholomew. So these are the sources that we are dealing with, right? And if you want to, if you are a Christian, you are perfectly happy to say, okay, all of that stuff is late legendary development. What's really important, what's like the kernel of historical truth, is the fact that Philip was martyred. You can say that, that's fine. But then you are basically saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that it's more likely that a Christian author would invent a miracle than that he would invent someone being martyred, right? Yeah. And then I would probably say that you have an anti-supernatural bias.
Yeah.
So all we are asking here is like stay consistent.
Yeah, the Christian is who who uses martyrdom as an apologetic in the case of Philip, for sure here, is basically in really bad shape. They either have to say, no, we really can't say Philip was martyred, or they have to say, yeah, he was, but then we've got to reject the swallowing of 7,000 people because of Philip's commandment or prayer to swallow those people up, and that Jesus rebuked him and all that. We have to reject that or accept it, and because we don't want to have to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, we have to accept all of it. Yeah, they're just in a real tough spot here.
Yeah, and if you, of course, if you accept it, if you accept the miracle stuff, then to be consistent, you have to accept miracles in other religions, because we have sources that are like comparatively late, like Apollonius of Tyana, for example. So you lose either way, I think. That's the trap that I've concocted for the Christian.
Okay, yeah. So we talked about Peter, James, John. Not much on Matthew, not much on Simon. We talked about Philip. We talked about Andrew. Did we talk? Yeah, we just talked about Bartholomew. Nothing much for Jude or Thomas. Did we got all of them? Did we miss anything?
We are missing Paul.
Oh, yeah, you want to go to the disciples. Because Paul was
we only have two. Matthias, who becomes the replacement for Judas, but for him we have nothing basically. And then we have Paul. And if you pull up number 1, that's really interesting. Yeah, so basically for Paul, again, we have like the first clear account is the Acts of Paul, and it's not much better than Acts of Philip. Like, for example, when they chop off Paul's head, milk for some reason just spills out of his neck and like sprays the executioner. I always imagine if you saw Kill Bill, like every time someone's head is chopped off from that in that movie, it's basically the same, except it's milk, not blood. And then Paul appears actually to Emperor Nero. Like there is an appearance of Paul to Nero, just like Jesus appears to people, Paul appears. And it's actually very common in these acts. After the martyrs are executed, there is like a their appearance to someone after they're died, after they're dead, basically. So that's the same level of sources that we are dealing with. But this is something that everyone is tripping over when it comes to martyrdom accounts, because it supposedly shows that Peter and Paul were martyred. Is the first Clement. It's the epistle of Clement of Rome. It's actually a forgery, but it's usually dated, I think, to like 80 to 130, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just quickly check that. Yeah, 80 to 140. And it's so if this is like factually correct, then it's a very early account of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. But the problem is, it doesn't actually say explicitly even that they were martyred. And I think in case of Paul, it's actually a very early evidence of natural death, probably in Spain. Because if you read it, the first paragraph is about Peter. It just says that he went through many labors and went to his appointed place of glory, which can mean anything, really, right? I didn't put it on the list because it's ambiguous. And I didn't want to trigger too many Christian apologists because they always bring this up as like the best evidence that we have for Peter and Paul. So in case of Peter, I think it doesn't explicitly say that he was martyred. It just means that he went to his appointed place of glory, which can just mean that he has like some super palace in heaven, even better than everyone else, because he was the best apostle. But for Paul, it says that he went to the extremity of the West, and having bore witness before rulers, he departed at length out of the world and went to the holy place. So first of all, it doesn't say that Paul was martyred, which I think that if Paul was actually martyred, like if it was true that he was beheaded in Rome by Nero, and this guy knew about it, Clement of Rome knew about it, he would actually say so. So you can make like an argument from silence by saying that, you know, we have this very early source, which is the closest to the events. It would be like 20 years after the fact. And he doesn't say that he was martyred when he's talking about how he died. That's one point. And the second point is, it says that he went to the extremity of the West, which means like the most western part of the known world, which at the time would be Spain. And he died there. And this is kind of consistent with the picture of Paul that we are seeing, where basically he starts by preaching in the Far East, given like how people thought about the world then, because he went to Arabia. He is converted. He starts by preaching Jesus for 3 years in Arabia. Then he goes to Palestine. Then he travels to Eastern Mediterranean, to Asia Minor, to Greece. Then he comes to Rome, and it looks like he wanted to continue further to the West because he wanted to kind of cover the entire known world with Christian churches. So this, according to this letter, he actually went to the extremity of the West, to Spain, and he died there, presumably through natural death.
So this
is like
this is found where this what we have in front of us.
It's First Clement 5, 1-7, I think.
Okay, I'm trying to think what the Christian would say to this. Yeah, the Christian's going to say, yeah, Kamil, it really sounds like he departed at length out of this world and went to the holy place. There's nothing about martyrdom here. But don't we have other sources that clearly state that Paul was martyred, persecuted, and killed for his beliefs?
Well, sure, but that would just be a contradiction, right? So you have contradictory sources, which is awesome.
Yeah. So the problem is, what Kamil is saying is, yeah, Christians, if you want to choose this source over this one, you can, but you still have to say to yourself that this is here. And
also a second point, which is extremely important, you have to remember that the probability of an account existing mentioning a natural death is not the same as the probability of an account mentioning martyrdom, because there is all kinds of reasons why Christians would want to say that an apostle was murdered, But there isn't really that many reasons why they would want to say that he died of natural death. So if we have a source which says that an apostle died of natural death, I would place much more confidence in that, right? Because that's something that was actually against the best interest a lot of these Christian authors. So I think like the natural death accounts probably trump the martyrdom accounts just on intrinsic probability, right? You have to, of course, take other things into account. Yeah.
That's a great point. It's like watching someone walk on water while eating a Snickers chocolate bar, and someone just writing about the Snickers chocolate bar and not that they're walking on water. You would expect more accounts on martyrdom than just, they just died of natural causes. Okay, anything else you want to bring up here?
Yeah, I just had, if you put up number 3, this is really funny. This has to do with James, the brother of Jesus, because there were actually 2 competing stories about how he died. One, of course, goes back to Josephus, who is a Jewish historian who writes about the events leading up to the Jewish war. And there's a very famous passage where he mentions the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, and how he was basically stoned for breaking the law by the high priest at the time. And this is what historians, both Christians and non-Christian, take to be one of the earliest extra-biblical mentions of Jesus. Of course, there are people who dispute it. They think that it wasn't actually talking about the brother of Jesus, our Jesus. It was actually talking about Jesus, the son of Damnius, who is mentioned later in the passage, and who is called Christ was just added there later by a Christian scribe. But in this version of accounts, this James, whoever that might be, is sentenced to stoning for breaking the law. But there was a separate set of stories, for example, by Clement of Alexandria, who says that James was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple, from the highest point of the temple, and it didn't kill him. He was still alive. So he was actually clubbed to death by a fueler, so by a crowd of people, and the fatal blow apparently was struck by a fueler. But the problem is that these are 2 contradictory accounts. So what Jerome, who was writing in the 4th century, in the end of the 4th century, did, he just harmonized the 2 accounts together. So he put them side by side by taking the 2 stories and basically just like smashing them together. And I highlighted that by using colors. So the blue stuff comes from the Jewish war, from the Antiquities of the Jews, from Josephus. The yellow stuff comes from this other tradition, and the red stuff is what he himself added, which isn't in either tradition. And the green stuff is everything that the 2 accounts have in common, which is only the fact that he died. So I just find this funny.
So Jerome was the first real apologist then.
No, actually, if it comes down to harmonizing, you can find all sorts of examples that are much, much earlier than that.
Oh, okay.
This is just one example that has to do with this specifically. Yeah. And what's really pisses me off, and this is what other early Christians did, for example, Origen or Eusebius, they claim that Josephus in his Antiquities specifically says that the reason why Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans and why the temple was destroyed is because the Jews killed James the Just, brother of Jesus, right? So these early Christian writers don't just believe this themselves. They claim that this is what Josephus says. But this is actually false, because we have the writings of Josephus. We know what Josephus says about the causes of the Jewish wars, and he never says anything like that. So there is a number, I think at least 4, early Christian writers who misrepresent what Josephus says. And imagine, like, if we didn't have the writings of Josephus, if, Antiquities of Jews and the Jewish war happened to be lost, we would have no idea that this is what they are doing, right? They are just lying, basically, about what a book which we can read today, says. And imagine if they are doing this with Josephus, which we can read. What all kinds of things they are also representing that we cannot check, because they are referencing sources which were lost.
State very concisely what Josephus said, what caused the Jewish war, and what the Christians said later.
Yeah, if you pull up number 5.
You see what I did there? I segued for you.
Yeah, exactly. So this is actually from an article, scholarly article, which is titled "The Causes of the Jewish War According to Josephus." Right? I didn't want to pull quotations from Josephus directly because there isn't like one place where Josephus explains what the causes of the war are. But if you actually read the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War, it's pretty clear that he's kind of painting the picture of the events that led up to open hostilities. It's like a very complicated story. There is a lot of like animosity between the Romans and the Jews. There is a lot of mismanagement and corruption by the Roman elite. But what's important is that nowhere Josephus says or even implies that the reason why the war happened is the killing of James, the brother of Jesus. And if you put up number 7, this is what the later early Christian authors say about this. So we have first the quotation from Josephus. This is the only thing that he says about James, the brother of Jesus. And then we have Origen, Eusebius, and Jerome, who all specifically claim that Josephus said that the reason why the war happened was the killing of James. And Eusebius even like invents a quotation, a direct quotation from Josephus, which doesn't exist, right? So he's direct. It seems he's directly quoting Josephus, but that quotation is actually nowhere to be found in Josephus. And you can kind of even see why these Christian authors want to say that. If you read, for example, Origen, because they are basically claiming that this is a hostile witness. They say, look, Josephus wasn't even a Christian, he was a Jew. But even he himself says that the reason why the Jewish war happened was the martyrdom of James. This was like a divine justice, right? Divine retribution by God for killing Jesus's brother. But they are just misrepresenting Josephus. That's insane, right? These are the people that we are relying on for all kinds of things, not just martyrdom, but like the history of the church in general.
The authorship of who wrote the Gospels, yeah. So some of the people who say we can be confident in who wrote the Gospels are basically lying of what Josephus said. Is that fair?
Exactly, yeah. You can't apologize for that. Like, you can't come up with an explanation, I think. You would have to really like twist yourself into a pretzel, as I think Bart Ehrman often says. So yeah, that's it. This is what I've been doing for the last week. I'm happy that I did that because I wanted to go through all of these sources myself, because, I want to know the truth. And it was an interesting exercise. I got to read a lot of martyrdom accounts and stuff like that. It's funny, like some of them are like really engaging novels. One of them is really like a horror, because the apostle is said to this city of cannibals that of course is fictional. We don't have any records of it existing, and there are really like descriptions of gory details of what the cannibals do to people and how they like eat their eyeballs and stuff like that. So some of it is fun. Some of the miracles are hilarious, of course, like miraculous diarrhea. But when it comes to historical reliability, I think I would stick with what we have for Socrates, for example, which is, of course, a martyr that has a very good historical attestation about him.
Okay, I'm going to sum up here, but before I do, if anybody has questions on this topic, we're only going to answer questions on this topic. Write them now. Tag me at PineCreek or at Kamil. Kamil, are you logged into the YouTube stream?
No, just have them tag.
Just tag me. Okay, so watch for my name as well. But let me sum up here. Christians stop it. Stop using the martyrdom apologetic. And here's why you should stop. Because your own people tell you to. When I say your own people, I mean other Christians. And some of them you respect. Guys like Sean McDowell says stop it. He says maybe for 4, maybe 6 at best, but stop it. Because these are not reliable texts. These sources, how we know it. Dan Wallace says something similar. William Lane Craig says something similar, that these are coming from later traditions and legends that have fantastical claims. So if you do pick and choose certain traditions and say, yes, I'm confident in my Christianity because of these martyrs, then you have to admit that you're picking and choosing based on extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And now you're back to doubting the resurrection itself, because that's an extraordinary claim without extraordinary evidence. They're not going to agree with that. But and keep in mind that besides Paul, there's no one in the New Testament who identifies themselves and says they actually even saw Jesus. And we are not even sure if they had the opportunity to recant. And even if they did recant, as Kamil said earlier, the law of Moses said they should still be put to death, at least by the Jews. So, is that a good summary? You want to add anything to that summary?
Yeah, it looks like it's not really mere Christianity. Even if you throw out the Old Testament, it's not enough to just accept the resurrection. You have to accept all kinds of stuff, like martyrdom accounts, the authorship of the Gospels, in order to be reasonably convinced that Jesus was actually raised. It's mere Christianity plus.
Nick Jr. asks, would this give scholars inductive reason to distrust Christian sources specifically? Yes. Or perhaps distrust Christian authors? I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but yeah, Christians even admit that these are unreliable sources. Trevor Lynn says the miracle of diarrhea. Christ's followers were scattered throughout the lands from the miracle of diarrhea. Yeah, it says it. Where are you right now, Kamil? In an undisclosed location?
I'm at my parents' house.
Oh, okay. Yes,
I'm on the run.
I think we've upset a few people.
Yeah, I think I should probably disclaim that we're not denying that Christians were persecuted and martyred. That obviously happened. We have a lot of very good evidence for that, and it's obviously tragic. Like if something like that happened today, I would be the first person to defend a Christian against persecution, right? We are just as good historians evaluating evidence for specific claims about specific people.
Yeah, and when you say that you don't doubt that some Christians were martyred, you're not saying that therefore means that they saw the resurrected Jesus, or that they had the opportunity to recant and all those things.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if all the parts in the martyrdom argument are in place, it still is only a problem for a hypothesis that the apostles intentionally lied about the resurrection. But if they were honestly mistaken, if they believed that they saw a resurrected Jesus but actually didn't, which is something that I think happens all the time in all religions, then they would still be willing to die, especially if they believe that it's going to give them the first-class ticket to the paradise, right, or to heaven.
Epic Christ asks, who did Paul kill? Who did the Apostle Paul kill? Actually, does it even say that the Apostle Paul killed anyone? It says he persecuted the Christians. It doesn't actually say he killed any of them.
Yeah, there is a hilarious story. If you remember, one of the ways how James was killed was that he was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple. In some accounts, he's actually thrown from the top of the stairs, and that's how he dies. And in one account, he's thrown from the top of the stairs. He survives, but the person who kind of ignites the incident is actually Paul. So in that version of the story, Paul already met James, and he was responsible for almost killing him. It's like a superhero movie where in some adaptations, the parents of Batman were actually killed by the Joker, because you kind of want to put all these characters together, right? Or in Spider-Man 3, it turns out suddenly that the guy who is responsible for killing Uncle Ben is actually Sandman, because he's supposed to be the villain in the story, and you want to have these stakes, right? So you see why an author of fiction would invent something like that, and that's probably why we don't have it in any other account. Like, this makes much more sense if your hypothesis is that these accounts are fictional.
Yeah. Mountain Show 1 asks, St. Thomas supposedly started the first church in India. Is there any proof of that? Sorry, I joined late. Is there any sources that say that he actually started the first church in India?
That's a good question. I think the earliest source is Acts of Thomas, which is usually dated to 200 to 225. It's very interesting because in there, Thomas obviously is a twin brother of Jesus. He's actually identical twin. And Jesus sells him to slavery in order to get him to India. And the problem is that there is an account from the end of the 4th century which says that the burial place of Thomas was in Edessa, Syria. So we have two accounts which are not like very far away in terms of if you place it on the timeline. One of them puts him in India, and the other one puts him in Syria. So you pick basically which version you like better.
Okay, so what you're saying, there are some sources there, but they're not reliable, which is basically what the Christians are saying as well today.
Yeah.
Trevor Lunn asks, were you surprised, Kamil, when you did all this research, that there was a lack of confirmation for the martyrdom claims used by apologists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was surprised by how fun it was to read through these sources, because like if someone told me like 10 years ago that I will be reading through like early Christian literature, I would probably think he's crazy, but it's much funnier than you think. And in terms of what the level of confidence is, I was actually like hearing a lot of stuff from apologetic circles about what the sources are. And obviously I was not impressed because the evidence is not there. And if you actually invest like a week really digging through that and going through the sources and reading the primary literature, yeah, I mean, if the evidence was really good, I would probably already know about it because the apologist would be shouting at my face, right? So not really.
Odd Lang Sin asks, or says, Carrier believes Peter, James, and Paul were probably arguing rabbis and highly educated. I guess the question is, do you agree?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to trigger a lot of Christians, so just like cover your ears for a while. Yeah, I think that the three pillars, James, John, and Cephas, who may or may not be identical to the people who are later depicted in the Gospels. It could be the case that they were just completely different people, not related to Jesus in any way, and none of the stories about them in the Gospels are historical. They were actually leaders of the church, of the Jerusalem church, at the same time as when Paul was writing Galatians, for example, and they were Torah observant, meaning they preach that you can only be saved if you follow the law of Moses. This is, for example, why Peter rebukes Cephas in Antioch, because he shows that he's a hypocrite, basically, for only following the law sometimes. And Peter is just some other guy who we know almost nothing about, but he also preached the gospel of circumcision, meaning he also preached that you can only be saved by following the law. So yeah, Christians can uncover their ears. I think this is pretty similar to what Carrier thinks.
Epic Christ says, Paul himself said in his letters that he wanted to be in prison and suffer for Christ. There's no question there.
Yeah, that's actually true. And if you read what early Christians write about martyrdom, they never say it's a bad thing. They are actually happy about it. Like, for example, Tertullian says that, I think he says something like that, the blood of the martyrs is like a fuel that's filling the spread of Christianity. And they always say, like, bring in more, like, we want more persecution, more punishment, more like flogging. And yeah, so they were definitely, it was a death cult. They definitely wanted to suffer for Jesus.
Which totally destroys the martyrdom apologetic then. It's like, why would they die for a lie? Or, well, I guess it doesn't destroy that part of it, but it destroys the idea that they want to survive, they want to live. They want to die for Christ, and so they would say, bring the martyrdom on.
Yeah, I think the way how it destroys the apologetic is that, yeah, Paul was in prison many times. He was flogged, but he was never martyred. Like it, like he's imagine, like Paul is arrested, he's put in jail. Why is he not brought before a Roman judge, showed the image of the emperor, and asked to burn some incense to it? Right? Like actually the earliest, if you are a Christian, the earliest and most detailed description of Paul being judged by King Herod and by a Roman governor is in Acts. And what do they say to each other? They say, we don't have any crime to charge Paul with, right? They let him go. And the only reason why Paul doesn't survive is because it's him who appeals to the emperor. So even in Acts, everyone says, like, we don't have any problem with Paul. What are you talking about, right? He doesn't preach anything offensive. There isn't anything criminal about what he says. That completely destroys the apologetic, because even Acts itself says that there wasn't any problem with preaching the resurrected Jesus, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. There was no problem with preaching the resurrection of Jesus, because
in Acts,
in
like,
the book of
why
Acts.
is Paul not killed by, I think it's Festus, the Roman governor at the end of Acts? Yeah, he basically lets him go because there isn't any problem.
Nick Jr. asks, can it be established if early Christians were more willing to lie for their doctrine than pagans at the time?
I would say very provisionally, yeah, maybe yes. And it's because one thing that's very different about Christianity, if you compare it to other religions, like pagan religions, is that Christianity was specifically based on what you believe. There was a requirement for a belief. You had to have specific beliefs. If you look at other religions, pagan religions, it was much more often about following the rituals exactly, right? That was the important thing. You can even see that, for example, in Judaism. Like, if you read through the Torah, it has a lot of descriptions of sacrifices that are supposed to be followed exactly, like which side of the altar you are supposed to sprinkle the blood and stuff like that. But it doesn't really go into that much detail about what you should believe and should not believe about the nature of God, for example. And we have writings from Romans, for example, in Cicero, where there are several people in conversation that believe completely different things about the gods, including gods don't exist at all, that have no problem talking to each other. They are friends, they are dialoguing and stuff like that. They obviously all follow all the procedures, like they sacrifice to the gods, they go to the temples and stuff like that, because that was the religion, that was what the religion was about. But in Christianity, it was specifically about the belief. And because it was about the belief, it was very important for these early Christian authors to establish like strong, reliable apostolic traditions backing up these beliefs. We see obviously the Orthodox fathers doing that as well, but we also see, for example, Gnostics trying to establish their own apostolic authority, going back to the apostles of Jesus, right? So yeah, I would say just by this feature of Christianity, there could have been higher incentive for these people to lie about historical events, because they had very good reason that the pagans didn't have.
James Linden asks, is there any evidence for the stoning of Stephen? Yeah, did we talk about Stephen? I don't think we did we?
Yeah, it's in Acts. We didn't talk about it because Stephen is not considered one of the people who saw the risen Jesus between the resurrection and the ascension. He, of course, in Acts, sees a vision of Jesus right before he dies. So if you believe that, then there you go.
So
That's actually pretty good because Acts are relatively early. They are much earlier than all the other sources that we were talking about usually.
So how would you answer this true or false question? True or false? There's evidence for martyrdom in the New Testament.
Yes, obviously, like true.
And which ones? Out of all the
You mean a martyrdom of specific people?
Oh, sorry, disciples, yeah. Of the 12 disciples and Paul and Matthias, because he replaced Judas, out of those 14, how many of those 14 would you say there's evidence of martyrdom within the New Testament?
I would say Peter. That's fine. Like I have no problem saying that Peter was martyred. That he died specifically because he was a Christian, just because the Gospel of John. I would say James because of Acts. Even though like my level of confidence is much lower because there's all kinds of problems with Acts as like in terms of historical reliability, when it should be dated and stuff like that. And that's probably it because the Jesus saying that the sons of Zebedee are going to be martyred, that doesn't have to necessarily be the New Testament basically commenting on these two people specifically being killed. It could just be a fictional story about martyrdom in general, which is just tied to these two people for literary purposes, right? So it doesn't even have to be the author of the Gospel of Mark knew that these two people specifically were martyred. That's why he put the story in. It could just be a fictional story where Jesus is commenting about martyrdoms. He says, look, you are going to be persecuted, expect persecution, because that's obviously what was happening to Christians when the Gospel of Mark was being written, right? Then you have Stephen, but the problem with the crucifixion, with the martyrdom of Stephen is that it seems to be based on, and in general, the books of Acts seems to be based on the Old Testament books, specifically on Second Maccabees, which has really powerful martyrdom stories from of Jews from the Maccabean revolt. For example, the story of Eleazar or the mother with the 7 sons and stuff like that. So it seems that these martyrdom stories are actually modeled after pre-existing stories of martyrdom from Judaism from the second century BCE.
Okay. That's interesting. So basically, at best, out of the 14 or 15 candidates who walked and talked with Jesus, well, we don't even say about that about Paul. 2 at best were martyrs. And that
I would maybe add James, the brother of Jesus, because I'm not convinced by the arguments that that's an interpolated passage, that wasn't actually in Josephus originally. So on the hypothesis that it was in Josephus originally, that Josephus intended to say that this is James, brother of Jesus, called Christ, and this is actually referring to the Jesus that we are talking about,
right.
Then I would say 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
But of those 3, that doesn't put any stock in the idea that they died. They wouldn't die for something they would know as a lie, or that they could have recanted.
Yes, if I was in the debate, like debating the resurrection, for example, I would have no problem just granting that for the sake of argument, because first of all, that only works against the idea that the apostles were lying intentionally, which I don't believe. Like, I don't think that Christianity started as a scam, basically. I think that if there were apostles who believed that Jesus appeared to them, they were just honestly mistaken. And I think there are very good hypotheses that can explain how that belief would arise if it was in fact mistaken. You don't need Jesus to be actually raised in order for the apostles to believe that Jesus was raised. Those two things, I think, are not connected. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing, I would just ask, okay, let's grant for the sake of argument that these apostles really saw the risen Jesus. What is your source for what they saw? Where can I read what they saw? And the Christian would, of course, have to point to the appearances, narratives in the Gospels. But if you accept those as historically reliable, then you no longer have to argue for the resurrection, right?
Right.
So it's kind of circular. Like the argument, the martyrdom argument only works if you presuppose that the appearances, narratives in the Gospels are reliable.
Right.
But if you accept that, you don't have to argue anything because you already believe the resurrection.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I titled this "Stop Using the Martyrdom Apologetic." Without looking, name the brothers, the 12 disciples who were brothers.
Of who? Of someone?
Yeah, like there's brothers in the 12. Which were the brothers? And the brothers
Yeah,
of who?
John and James are the sons of Zebedee, so they are brothers.
Ding, ding,
James
correct?
the Just, who? Sorry?
Correct.
Yeah, James the Just, who is not among the 12, is a brother of Jesus. Simon the Zealot is maybe Simon, the brother of Jesus. At least he's conflated with him in some accounts.
Yes, that's right.
And there is James, son of Alphaeus, and I think someone else is also called son of Alphaeus. I think Matthew. Right?
Yes. Yep. So, did you say Matthew and who?
Matthew and James, sons of Alphaeus. I think they
James
are
the younger.
Yeah. And
but there's another guy who's maybe a brother of James the younger and Matthew.
I don't know, but Thomas Didymus is obviously a twin brother of Jesus. Everyone knows that.
The answer is Jude.
They're identical.
Jude. Some say that Jude, James the younger, and Matthew are all brothers, and you miss Peter and Andrew, that they're brothers.
Oh yeah. That's the obvious one. Okay, so that was a family business.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for doing that. So I hope this all this research comes in handy when you get your PhD and whatever.
Yeah, sure. I want to reiterate the reason why I decided to do that is because Captain Fartlicker in the comment section of your last video suggested that. It was the one before that, not the last one, with Cam and T-Jump. So if you have interesting topics that you wanted us to look at, then let us know.
I want everybody to know that Fartlicker is not his real name. He's also known as Bartholomew or Nathaniel or Thaddeus or Lebbaeus or Judas. Oh, Jude and Judas. Like some people say Jude, his real name was Judas. Did you ever hear that?
Yeah, that was one of the most common names. It just means the Jew. So Jesus is literally betrayed by the Jews. By the Jew.
Okay, so I'm going to start the music.
Yeah.
I'm gonna poof. Well, that was fun. So you said you spent 5 days on this?
6 days, yeah.
6 days?
On and off.
Wow.
Yeah, I wanted to read some of all of the sources, of course, anyway, so it's just sooner than later, right? I had to postpone reading the Jewish Apocrypha, which is also fascinating, like the Apocalypses, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, Enoch, and stuff like that.
I think Sean McDowell did his PhD in this, or some thesis.
Well, if that's true, then that's terrible, because
That's
in
terrible.
terms of like methodology of history and just like valid inferences, the book is atrocious. And you can read reviews. There is probably nothing I could say about that hasn't already been said.
Which book is worse,
But
Sean McDowell's or Bockham's?
Bockham's definitely, and I'll tell you why. If you read Josh McDowell, like, you don't have to be smart in order to see immediately that what he's saying is like doesn't follow. But Bockham it's more difficult to see why he's wrong. for example, a lot of people buy his research into frequency of names. So you need to know a little bit about statistics, for example, in order to see why that doesn't follow. Yeah, that's my ranking at the moment.
Okay, well, my apologies to Jesus. He was scheduled to come on and join us today, but we ran out of time. Thanks, guys, for hanging out on a Saturday afternoon if you live in the United States. And what time is it there in Eastern Europe?
It's exactly midnight.
Oh, midnight. Okay, go to bed. Thanks, guys. See you next time.